Okay. Hello, everybody. We start this exciting session, the last one in this very nice conference on migration. And well, all the presenters have 15 minutes, 5 minutes for the discussion. I think I will tell you when you have 3 minutes left. And we start with Migrant Health and Wellbeing by Jakub Lonsky. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my slides? Sorry, can you see my slides? I can.
Yes,
okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Just to double check. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to present here. And so I'm going to be talking about immigrant health and well-being, which will be part of the Handbook of Labor, Human Resources and Population, edited by Klaus Zimmermann. And this is a work with my former PhD advisor, Osea Giuntella in Pittsburgh. And so I'm essentially going to be reviewing the state of the literature on this topic. So there's an increasing interest among scholars and policymakers alike in understanding health trajectories of immigrants. And so there are a number of reasons why this could be an interesting and important topic to study. So of course, there's the rapid movements of individuals across the globe has been accelerating due to the globalization, and this poses new epidemiological challenges. But also, it's important to shed light on immigrant health trajectories, which is crucial to fully understand the impact of immigration on welfare. And health trajectories of migrants can help us understand the origins of ethnic health differences and disparities. And last but not certainly not least, also health trajectories of immigrants affect through differentials the health of the natives. And so all these reasons are quite important to study this topic. So my talk is going to just go quite quickly through three separate parts of this topic. So the first one is migrants and interesting population to study population health trajectories. So why is it important to learn about health transition, about immigration and the health of immigrants, to understand the health transition in sending countries? So there's a seminal work by Marmot and also later sort of replicated by Itzo and Cotters, which shows the Japanese immigrants in the US with stronger adherence to the original Japanese culture are associated with lower risk of coronary heart disease. And so, similarly, we also have a Rosetta study of Italian Americans in the US, which shown that there are essentially better health outcomes of immigrants in the destination countries. Now, what's important is analyzing health trajectories of immigrants allows exploiting changes in environmental risk factors while observing population which is generally similar in the sending countries, but those that did not immigrate. And so basically analyzing these adjustment patterns of immigrants to these new environments, which often happens quite fast, so in a matter of months or years, can help us understand what could happen eventually in a matter of decades in descending countries. Now, also, it's important to study immigrant health trajectories to predict what will happen to population health trajectories in the receiving countries. So not only in the sending countries, but also on the receiving end. And in particular, in many receiving countries or destination countries, immigrants represent a very large share of population, and in many cases also increasing. So just taking the case of the US, we have the Hispanics and Latinos, which represent about 1/6 of the population. But it is estimated that by 2035, they will represent about 1/4 of the population. And so even though the death rate among Hispanics is actually lower than the non-Hispanic whites, when we look at certain diagnoses such as diabetes or liver disease, the chances of Hispanics or Latinos dying is actually significantly higher in those diagnoses. And we also know that their access to health insurance and by extension to the healthcare is significantly worse. And so this is a relatively young population, but because this population will age just as the population in the US is aging and their share is increasing in the population, this will pose additional challenges as the time will come. Okay, so the next part is to understand and talk a little bit about the healthy immigrant effect and the healthy immigrant paradox. So these two phenomena observed throughout the world. And so the first is the healthy immigrant effect. So from many different studies in different countries, in different settings, we know that in general, upon arrival, immigrants tend to be healthier and significantly healthier than the comparable native-born population, despite having obviously lower socioeconomic status. And this tends to be true for a range of outcomes from mortality through infant health, hypertension, obesity, or self-reported health. So this is kind of one first stylized fact and observed phenomenon, the healthy immigrant effect. Now, the second one is the healthy immigrant paradox. So even though immigrants start better off in terms of their health, they tend to assimilate over time. And basically, in terms of their health, they tend to get close to the native population. So their initial health advantage tends to erode. And again, this is observed for various outcomes listed here. But it's also important to say that this is not a uniform thing across different immigrant groups, but there is heterogeneity in this convergence across different groups. So the question is really, what can explain these two phenomena? And so first, looking at the healthy immigrant effect. So there have been three proposed mechanisms. The first one is migrant selection on health. The second one is protective factors associated with lifestyle behaviors in sending countries. And the last one is the Salmon bias, basically saying that there is some sort of selection on return migration, and perhaps those who are sickly and not particularly in good health tend to return back into their countries of origin. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of these, but let's just talk about the first one, because it is essentially the most important, as to say, in the literature, and the migrant selection on health. Now, obviously, looking at the theoretical models of migration and migrant decisions, health plays an important role because it affects the cost, but also the returns to the migration. Now, looking at the empirical evidence, it does suggest that there is a mild selection on health among immigrants in their sending countries. And interestingly, even this mild selection on health seems to be enough to explain the immigrant native health differences in the destination countries. Now, of course, the health selection is only going to happen for certain types of immigrants, for example, economic migrants. And so kind of support this channel, the study is looking at asylum seekers, where certainly the extent of health selection is going to be very limited. Indeed, we do not observe this selection playing a role among the asylum seekers. Okay, so now what about the healthy immigrant paradox? And so again, there are three proposed main channels. So the first one is cultural assimilation. The second one is immigrant working condition. And the third one is the familiarity with healthcare system and the access to healthcare. So again, I'm just going to talk briefly about the first and the second one, leaving the last for if you have any further questions about that. So the cultural assimilation. Now, naturally, as immigrants spend time in the destination countries, they tend to assimilate. They tend to assimilate in terms of in linguistic terms, in terms of cultural norms and norms of behavior, but also some lifestyle choices. And this will affect, for example, lifestyle choices in terms of what kind of food they're consuming, the behavioral choices in terms of some healthy diets or habits, and they tend to assimilate towards what the natives do. And so in one of the studies I already mentioned in my citations, the Anteko and Bedard, even though immigrants entering into the US on average have significantly lower BMI than the average natives, male and the female immigrants, they tend to converge and relatively fast. So for example, for female immigrants, they close this BMI gap within 10 years. And for male immigrants, they tend to close the third of the gap within 15 years. So the convergence is slower, but it's still there. Now, there's an interesting study on this topic. My co-author, Osea Giuntella, has done a linking birth records from California and Florida. And he shows that second generation Hispanics who are more likely to have culturally assimilated have higher risk of giving birth to children with low birth weight. So this would support this mechanism. Okay, so the second one is the role of working conditions, which is particularly interesting in my opinion, because we know again from a number of studies that immigrants tend to be more likely to work in more physically demanding, so manual intensive jobs, which often are more risky jobs. And they also tend to work in jobs where there are more irregular schedules and more likely to work in night shifts. And there are different reasons behind that. The differences in risk perception, risk knowledge, risk aversion. Of course, that's something that affects the migrant decision to begin with. But also immigrants tend to have comparative advantage in manually intensive tasks as opposed to the communication intensive tasks, but also, for example, lower disseminating costs from working at night, let's say. And we know from public health literature that these kind of jobs tend to have long-run negative impact on individuals' health. For example, working at night often or working irregular schedules can undermine or can disrupt the circadian rhythm. And this has been linked to increased risk of liver cancer and other liver diseases. Okay, so that much on the part two. Now, let's move up to the last part of this talk. And that's talking about the impact that the immigration policy can have on immigrant health and well-being. And of course, here there are going to be two types of policies that I will discuss. First being the immigration regularization or legalization, the pro-immigration policy. And the second one being the opposite, the immigration enforcement, the, so to speak, anti-immigration policy. So looking at the immigrant regularization, we know that in many countries, including the United States, unauthorized immigrants or not documented immigrants have limited access to public programs, including public health insurance coverage, which in the US is the Medicaid, the insurance system, the insurance program for the poor, and the Medicare, the insurance program for the elderly. Now, on top of that, and of course, this limits their access to healthcare and could have long-run effects on their health. There is also just the constant threat of deportation creates a chronic stressors that could affect health directly. So we would expect any amnesty programs to lead to better access to healthcare and ultimately improve immigrant health. And so studies have looked at these recent policy in the US called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or the DACA, which was a large-scale temporary.
You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Temporary regularization policy by President Obama in 2012. And they have found that it increased insurance coverage among eligible immigrants without really increasing substantially the healthcare utilization, which could be explained by a relatively young population being targeted by this program. But also importantly, there have been some improvements in mental health status, especially among those living in poverty. Now, interestingly, when we kind of follow people being affected by this policy later on, studies have shown that some of these effects have been undermined by the Trump administration's consistent efforts to repeal the program, which really have lasted for years. And eventually the program has prevailed as of now, but there has taken toll on the mental health and, for example, sleep patterns of these immigrants. Now, the immigrant enforcement policies, on the other hand, can have chilling effects, and not only on the people who should be affected, but also, for example, on the non-citizens' children who themselves are citizens. And so this is, for example, the work of Watson, 2014, but also the work looking at this Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which has shown that even though, let's say, Medicaid rates decline among non-citizens, the immigrants were able to substitute for this lack of coverage, lack of public coverage, by getting employer-sponsored plans, so by working more. But also, this kind of program restricted access to, for example, welfare programs or food stamps, and increased food insecurity, which is linked to worse health outcomes among children. Now, that was a federal immigration enforcement policy. However, in the US, there's also variation in local immigration enforcement, because there's this section 287G, which essentially instructs local departments to work with Department of Homeland Security into expediting the deportation process. And some jurisdictions chose to cooperate with the DHS, others did not. So it creates some local variation, and studies have shown that this increased food insecurity risk, for example, among immigrant Hispanic children, but also there's anecdotal evidence of chilling effects of immigrant healthcare utilization and health. So just to conclude, there's growing interest in understanding the complex dynamics that characterize health trajectories of migrants. As economists, we have contributed to this literature twofold. So on the theoretical side, we've provided framework to analyze both the health selectivity at migration and subsequent convergence, but also on the empirical side, we have tried to and successfully tried to deal with some of the empirical challenges arising when trying to disentangle the role of environmental factors and so on in influencing health patterns. Now, empirical literature shows that there is growing evidence on the importance of selection on health and migration, but also there is support of this health immigrant paradox showing that over time immigrants tend to assimilate to natives in their health. Now, of course, more research is needed to just fully understand migrant health trajectories and the process of unhealthy immigration. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
Marina?
Yes, I have one, but I don't know anything about this. Oh, sorry, Klaus.
Okay, Ira can go first. Okay. Ira?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So, whatever the health status of immigrants when they come to the U.S., all of these other factors are important. But there's one set of factors that you don't address, and that is simply that immigrants over time, but some immediately, begin to face the same relative prices and closer income as U.S. natives. So you expect them to change their diets and behavior along lines of natives and suffer the health consequences of that. That's all, just another.
Yeah, certainly. Although I think that just purely in terms of the gap, that really shouldn't make the gap disappear, right? So in the terms of the trend, certainly, and I think from the data we see that the immigrants the trajectories have the same trends, but the fact that the gap is closing, I think suggests that there must be something more. But it's a good point.
I mean, the gap can close because they react. I'm not pushing this Chicago view, but it could be that, you know, they look at relative prices and then they close the gap. They're the same, they're facing the same prices, at least whatever prices are in their neighborhoods.
So like a difference in adaptation to those changes. Yeah, certainly. Some like heterogeneity between immigrants and natives, yes.
Klaus?
Okay, yes, thank you. Now, it seems that you, when you talk about the health of immigrants, you look more on the supply side of health of migrants. So people come and they are healthy or not, but they decide whether they come or whatever. However, there is also demand side. Yes, I mean, receiving countries may wish to have certain healthy migrants, and they may check for it, in particular in the future, perhaps even when we see more of COVID type of issues. Now, in the past, if you look at guest worker programs, that was always part of the program. So let's say the German guest worker program in the 60s. Were people who were selected, there were health checks in embassies of Germany, in Turkey, and in other countries. Yes. So how to what extent is your chapter covering this kind of research, dealing with that kind of issue?
Right, it's an excellent point. So I'm afraid at the moment we haven't really looked at this angle. So it's something certainly to add, as this is a work in progress. Yes, I agree. And for example, even in the US, right, we know historically that immigrants were always checked at the Ellis Island coming into the country. Even today, you know, applying for a green card means going through extensive medical checks. So it's an excellent point. So I think we need to look more into what's the state of literature on that, on these demand factors. Thank you.
Okay, it would be nice. Yeah. Okay. So otherwise, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yes, I was thinking about the same thing. For example, in some countries, I don't know in others, but in Italy, a full range of vaccinations are required to have a regular permit of immigration. And that can be a reason also for a healthy initial period after the immigration, which fades with time. And I was okay, that's it. I think that time has run out, so we have to go to the next, which is Naturalization, Citizenship, and Identity Documents by Catalina Amuedo-Dorantes. Okay.
Thank you. All right, let me pull that a second. To the top. Just a couple of seconds. Okay. Let me see if it shows up.
You can see it now.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. I was trying to see if I could remove the comments. Yes. All right. Okay. So this is, thank you, everybody. And thank you for the invitation to present. So this is what we did in this chapter of the book really is to summarize what is it that we know from the literature regarding naturalization, citizenship, and a little bit also of discussion regarding identity documents. This is joint work with Anne-Marie Kietzerow and Susan Pozo. And basically the questions that we ask ourselves were questions such as what is citizenship and what is nationality? What are the principles that regulate both around the world? And how are those principles related to the growing prevalence of dual citizenship as well as statelessness? And how are the various citizenship regimes related to migrants' assimilations in the host countries and to the portability of certain rights across borders? So this was pretty much the aim of our chapter, addressing basically these questions. So just starting with citizenship and nationality, I mean, if one goes with just the American Heritage Dictionary of the English language, basically we find that citizen is just defined as a person that owes loyalty to and is entitled by birth or naturalization to the protection of a given state, whereas nationality refers to people having common origins or traditions. So this already hints at the distinction between the two. Citizenship appears to be grounded in the notion that what connects individuals is the relationship they have with the state, whereas nationality is more of a cultural concept. It basically relates to this idea of what unifies individuals is really a shared identity. So the definitions again suggest that citizens are going to be more like members of the country, while nationality involves this notion of belonging. And the differences between these two concepts really go back to distinct avenues to acquiring citizenship. So basically, under jus soli, citizenship is acquired when one is born within the territory of the state. And then there is also this, under the jus sanguineum, on contrast, individuals gain citizenship by being born either to someone with the ancestry of the state. And some scholars have characterized citizenship via jus soli as a civic citizenship, whereas basically citizenship via jus sanguinei tends to be characterized as an ethnic citizenship. So we actually review what are the different types of birthright citizenship. Typically, it's distinguished, the Law Library of Congress distinguishes between what they call unconditional birthright citizenship. And this basically consists in conferring at birth citizenship to individuals that are born within the borders of the territory, irrespective of anything else. And then you also have, for many countries, what we label as conditional birthright citizenship. So as the title, as it basically conditional hints on, it basically depends on certain requirements being met. It can be after reaching a particular age or after living a specified number of years in the country. So when you look at the prevalence of these regimes around the world, basically from a sample of about 193 countries, about 18% adhere to unconditional birthright citizenship. And, you know, looking at population that basically is subject to those regimes, a very similar share of the world's population resides in countries that allow for that type of regime. So in fact, it is very common in the Americas. Unconditional birthright citizenship is really widespread there. And in contrast, for example, in Europe is close to zero. There are mixed regimes, and I'll get to that. Okay, and less than 10% overall in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. So very distinct. If we look instead of unconditional, conditional, we look at basically jus soli, for example, as opposed to jus sanguinis. With the same sample of countries, you find that about 40% of the countries adhere to the jus soli, this notion of birthright citizenship. And if you use population weights, about 1/4 of the world's inhabitants enjoy birthright citizenship. Actually, yeah, getting closer to 1/3 there. And these differences really in percentages here really are due to very populous countries such as China and India, that none of them adhere to the jus soli principle. One can also ask what determines citizenship regime countries, why countries adhere to one regime and the other. And people have done research on this topic. They basically have looked at a sample of about 160 countries over which they collected data continuously. And basically what they conclude, what is interesting is that the share of countries that adhere to jus soli has been diminishing over time. It used to be 47% back in 1948. It has fell to basically about 24 by 2001. And a number of studies have addressed what causes this. Some people argue that demographic stagnation and democracy scores are linked to the adherence to jus soli. Whereas, for example, border changes, when you have the breakup of a state or decolonization, actually appear to inhibit it. It's also interesting, some of the literature alludes to basically the role of rising migration flows and how they affect the adoption of one regime versus another. And they argue that basically migration flows result in fewer citizenship liberalization policies under a jus soli principle, but not necessarily under the jus sanguinis. So very related to this is this notion of dual citizenship. A lot of countries have provided this possibility, and it has been a growing share as well over time. And I wanted to show you some data here. So basically this comes from the Global Expatriate Dual Citizenship data set, and it outlines dual citizenship statuses from 1960 to the present to basically 2000 here. But really informs about 193 countries. And dual citizenship really is more prevalent today than it used to be in the past. Basically, back in 1960, about 1/3 of the countries allowed for dual citizenship. Today, more than 3/4 do. You should read actually 2020, my table up here. And there is actually also very large variation across regions in the world. So basically, dual citizenship is practically universal in the Americas, but only 16% of Asians actually can assume 2 nationalities. So some other countries really do not offer it. Another extreme from dual citizenship is this notion of statelessness, and which basically refers to the inability to claim belonging to a particular state. It is actually quite prevalent. United Nations report that it's about 4.2 million, but the true figure is known to be closer to 12. And the discrepancy between these figures really comes from some of the countries really that are known to have stateless populations, not producing a number for United Nations. Other countries really just simply do not submit any reports whatsoever. And finally, United Nations also assumes many stateless individuals under its refugee count. And those individuals are not enumerated in the 4.2 million count. So these are some of the reasons for the difference. Statelessness is also, as I said, is quite prevalent. of the figure of the 4.2 million, here you can see that more than half of that population is currently residing in Asia. But again, it's important to remember that this is 4.2 versus the known figure that most people think it's closer to almost 12 million. What are the causes of statelessness? There are many. Sometimes they can arise due to conflicts in nationality laws. So for example, you can have an individual that is basically born in a Jew-Sanguini country, but to parents who are citizens of a Jew-Soli nation. And then in that case, the child cannot claim citizenship neither in the territory of birth nor through descent. So basically under Jew-Sanguini, basically you have this intergenerational statelessness that can persist for quite some time. Other times is due to changes in borders, decolonization or state succession. And for example, one example that I included here basically was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Estonia maintained that its occupation by the Soviets had been illegal. And based on its Jew-Sanguini tradition, it denied nationality for many Russian speakers and their descendants. Other times it comes because of arbitrary deprivations of nationality. So a good example of this was in 2010. There was an amendment to the Dominican constitution that effectively turned unconditional Jew-Soli citizenship into conditional. And it started to deny Dominican nationality to any individual that was born in the Dominican Republic to irregular migrants. So this went all the way to the High Court of the land. And the High Court basically effectively ruled that the change in citizenship policy was going to be retroactive to 1929. And as a result, it denationalized generations of Haitians. And given citizenship laws in Haiti, where basically Jew-Sanguini claims of citizenship need to be made by age 18, a lot of Haitians became denationalized and became stateless. As other times, some countries have gender-based laws concerning the passage of nationality under Jew-Sanguini system. So for example, in 2020, 25 countries treated mothers and fathers unequally with respect to the conferral of citizenship to the offspring. And only one of those countries actually had safeguards in place just to make exceptions in case of the child became stateless. In the other 24 countries, it was not. Yes, Marina,
you have 3 minutes.
Okay, so other times it's related to parentage and citizenship laws that may be incompatible with assisted reproductive technologies, and other times it's just a de facto change. So sometimes individuals do not have proper identity documents, and as a result of that, basically, you know, if they have a Jew-Sanguini, they cannot, for example, provide information concerning birth circumstances, and they become de facto stateless. Well, I'm going to skip through some of this. I would just say that why we care about citizenship is because it has multifaceted implications. Of course, we all know about the many consequences of citizenship, even when acquired through naturalization. We have known that it's lower poverty rates, higher earnings, access to a broader safety net, ability to participate in the electoral process, sponsorship of white family members for legal permanent residency, and so on. And the way that we know about this is because people have exploited either natural experiments, as in the case of changes in nationality laws, as it was the case in Germany back in May 1999. And people have found that it can have very significant implications on children's education, health, and parental behavior. Other times, people address the question by exploiting extension of dual citizenship rights. Francesca Mazzolari has a really nice article on this, looking at changes in dual citizenship by some countries in Latin America between 1990 and 2000. And she documents actually significant employment and earnings gains. So we know that citizenship matters. Citizenship rights sometimes can be moved across borders. And I will just say there that, of course, this occurs the most when you have dual citizenship arrangements. And I would just say, I'm going to skip this part. I wanted to say a couple of things about other rights that are important across borders that some countries have facilitated. One of them is the well-known right to return. In some cases, for example, the Nikkei gene, they were descendants from a large Japanese immigration wave, and they were allowed actually to return. I just wanted to say that this was a very interesting case where basically initially during the Meiji Restoration, Japan transformed into a more industrialized modern economy, and basically a lot of low-skilled workers lost employment. They were given the opportunity to migrate to some regions in Latin America. They resided there for many generations, and back in 1990, Japan allowed these individuals to return back to Japan, to their ancestral land. And many of them have returned, but very few have really assimilated to the extent of even wanting to naturalize. So this is just one of the examples of the right to return. There are other important rights, and I will just say that one of them is the rights to vote across borders. And here we can find that everything around the world. There are some countries that prevent migrants from voting, other ones that allow the person to go back home and vote in person. Other countries, most of them allow permanent migrants to vote by mail. And then there are a few countries that even allow immigrants to elect their own representation in legislative elections. So some of them do that too. And the last one, with regards to something about expatriation and protection as an expat, just wanted to say.
The time is over.
Okay, so I'll just basically say that it's a concept that has changed over time. And so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, this is a very fascinating.
Yes, really. Yes.
Okay, questions. May I ask other questions? I don't see any. May I ask you a question? You talked about the changes in the U.S.A.
Yes.
Yeah, the countries of U.S.A. generally were those of immigration, and the jus sanguinis of emigration. And well, do you have something to say about the change in jus sanguinis? For example, Italy is one of the countries with the strongest norms on jus sanguinis because the immigrants wanted it in the 20s of last century. But now is, well, it leads to some paradoxes about voting rights, etc. So are you talking also about the changes in the jus soli?
So we look at basically, there's a number of countries that have these mixed regimes. I mean, Spain, for example, like Italy has the jus sanguinis. Is the prevalence in the civil code?
Sorry, in the jus sanguinis, I wanted to say, not in jus soli, in jus sanguinis, yes.
Yes. So Spain, for example, has the jus sanguinis too, but it has allowed for certain exemptions, and a lot of countries do. When, for example, there are children that are born to migrants there in Spain, where basically the parents are either stateless or their countries of nationality do not allow for the child to acquire citizenship from the parents.
Yeah.
And so in those cases, they do a combination of jus soli and jus sanguinis. So in that case, the kid can become Spanish, just basically to avoid statelessness on the child. So most countries actually, to be quite frank, of the jus sanguinis, a lot of them have some exceptions as well for jus soli to allow for these cases, to prevent statelessness in these cases. But I mean, there's a lot of research that really looks at this idea of whether jus soli or jus sanguinis prevailed more as countries were colonizing other territories. And basically, it has changed over time with decolonization. It has changed with increased migration flows. And so basically, and also with the interest of countries of claiming citizens that they can come back, immigrants that can come back and contribute to the economy.
Yes. Other questions? Yes, Klaus.
Yeah, just a quick question. There are people who are concerned that dual citizenship would mean not enough integration. What do we know really? Of course, it's a complex correlation. I am aware of this. What do we know of this?
So there's a lot of discussion when I was reading on the topic. There's a lot of discussion actually even among philosophers on what is right, and is it should we have dual nationality? Can a person actually claim alliance to two different nations? Are they following the rules of two different nations? Should they have a say in what happens in another country or vote in another country if they are really not there and not living there? So there's a lot of complexities around a lot of discussions and debates of what is right and what isn't, and what should prevail and shouldn't. But the reality is that a lot of countries have moved to dual nationalities simply because of economic interest.
Yeah.
So they really want to attract back immigrants. They also want to, it facilitates exchanges of ideas, investment. And so a lot of countries really have broadened, basically this, have adopted and embraced this dual nationality idea simply because of that.
Okay. This also means that diasporas are supported. I mean, but this also means that the nation state may lose less strength. I mean, may lose strength.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes, that is true. That is true. And actually, but those diasporas also help a lot. For example, there was a discussion how Turkish immigrants actually contributed with Turkey entering the European Union. So there's you know, through the lobbying abroad from Turkey. So it can have positive impacts for the economy as well.
Yes. And Morocco maybe also.
Yeah,
I'm sorry
that's
the
true.
time is over. So it's fascinating, but we have to go on with another very interesting presentation on brain drain or gain by Stefanija Veljanoska.
Thank you very much. So I'll first try to share my screen. It doesn't like, I cannot put it on big. Okay, here it is. Okay, thank you very much everyone for joining this session, and thanks to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to present this study, which is in progress. So it's a joint work with Frederic Docquier. And what do we try to do here is to provide an updated assessment about whether high skill immigration actually generates a cost or benefit for countries of origin. So let me start with some brief introduction. Well, we observe increasing trends in international migration, and we have rising concerns about a potential loss in terms of welfare and economic growth that might happen in countries of origin related to the fact that there is a higher and higher immigration rates among high-skilled workers. So we clearly talk about positive selection and self-selection among migrants. Why? Because studies have shown that high-skilled workers have greater propensity to immigrate than low-skilled workers. So to what this self-selection is due to? Well, high-skilled workers or high-skilled people are more responsive, let's say, to economic opportunities or political conditions in foreign countries. Also, they can have some skills that are more easily transferable. They have also greater ability to gather and process information. And also they have greater facility to, for example, finance the migration costs. So when the economic literature started to be interested in this topic, let's say between the 70s and the 90s, mainly economic studies have risen in terms of the fact that high-skilled immigration actually generates a clear welfare cost for countries at origin. So, and this welfare cost, if you want, it's even expected to be even larger when we have that people from some key occupations are the ones that immigrate, such as engineers, medical doctors, teachers, and so on. And also this will limit to some extent, for example, the capacity of the home country, to adopt new technologies. So plus we will have that with this outflow of high-skilled migrants, we'll have that the immigration will decrease the market size, and in the end, we'll end up with a smaller number of, let's say, monopolistic entrepreneurs that are at places that can operate, and this have more persecution on the prices and on the, let's say, the diversity of goods that are available in the origin country. But more recently, on the contrary, we have some, let's say, a rise in the literature, a rise of the potential benefits that might occur when we have a high level of high-skill immigration. So this recent literature actually highlights those benefits, and the most, let's say, undebatable one are remittances, whether they're material or immaterial. Also, some studies have shown as well that high-skill migration can actually participate in global business networks that can have positive externalities on home countries. This can also stimulate the transfer of technology. And the final, let's say, benefit that we'll really look at in this paper, in this study, is the fact that the immigration of high-skilled workers can actually initiate local residents of the home country to have a higher and higher education. So, accounting for the fact that we have clear, let's say, losses and also some potential benefits, we are interested in what is in the end the net effect. And would it be the case that maybe for some countries, under some conditions, we might observe a gain rather than a brain drain? Okay, so how do we do this? So as I said, we attempt to provide an updated quantitative assessment of what will be the impact of immigration on the human capital accumulation and economic growth in the country of origin. We first start by doing a very simple empirical exercise building on some existing papers, where we'll look at the impact of immigration on human capital accumulation. We take those estimates and then we run a simulation exercise when we look what would be the loss in terms of whether there is a loss in terms of human capital accumulation when we have a positive selection and in a contrafactual scenario when we don't have. And in the last exercise, so first we look at the human capital accumulation, but very similarly, we look also what will be the incidence of positive selection on the economic growth using a development accounting model a la Jones. So we do use this model in order to account for the different mechanisms that were considered and found in the literature. And the difference with previous studies is that instead of doing like a global analysis, we try to look individual at countries separately. Okay, just preview of the results in case I don't have time to present it all. So we do observe a brain gain, especially in low income and what we consider as lower middle income countries. But this brain gain is not very high and significant. You will see the figures are pretty much low. So we do observe that there is a positive influence of the immigration rate on the capital, on the human capital formation and accumulation over time. And the same is the case in terms of income gains or worker income gains as well. So we do observe this brain gain, especially for countries that are in the, let's say, lower part of the wealth distribution across the globe. Okay, so first, very briefly, we use some very standard data sets in order to compute some first, what we try to do actually to look at this, just to evaluate this positive selection. So we use first the ad-hoc data set from Artuk et al., where we have dyadic migration stocks for the year 1990s and 2000, and then we complete it with a more recent data, the database on migration from the U.S.A countries that has more or less the same information. So here I just have provided some very basic measures of immigration that we have, So here we have simply the average countrywide immigration rate, that is simply the weighted average from the immigration of the high skilled, here the index age, and of the low skilled workers. So what can we do in the end is that we can provide a very descriptive statistics on what can be the positive selection in a country by simply considering the ratio between the immigration rate of the high skilled workers and immigration rate of the low skilled workers. So in this table, what we did is that we all along the study, we tried to really take into consideration different level of economic development. So here we have classified all the countries in our sample in 4 categories. So this is GDP in the US dollar 2000 and PPP. And we roughly, let's say, follow the World Bank classification depending on the lower, upper, let's say lower middle, and upper middle, and upper and high income countries. So if we just, for the sake of time, if we look at the population weighted averages, so here we have the average migration across countries, but what we are interested in is to look at the, let's say, the evolution or the state of immigration rates for the high skilled and the low skilled workers. So what do we observe is that clearly we have a decrease of the migration, of the immigration rates of high skilled workers across the different income groups of countries. Whereas we have, so we have higher immigration rates for lower income countries and lower immigration rates of higher workers for high income countries. So we look at that this immigration, so this positive selection to some extent, it decreases with income. However, this is not the case for low skilled migrants. So we observe that, for example, in poorer country or low income countries, we have a much lower rate of migrants, of low skilled migrants than high skilled migrants. So how can we interpret this? Why there is such a difference? Well, probably we suppose it is related to the fact that there are financial costs to cover when we decide to migrate, and high skilled migrants are the ones that have more facility to cover these costs. Okay, so once we descriptively just show that there is indeed a positive selection among migrants, we try to look at, I will skip this for a question of time. We try to look at what would be their incidence on the human capital formation and growth. So we build up on Bain et al. Of 2008. This is their specification, where as a dependent variable we have the log change proportion in the proportion of college graduates. And this is expressed as a function of the initial stock of college graduates and the immigration rate of high skilled workers, which is our key variable of interest, and then some other control variables. So how do we modify this specification, where we put this term in relative, we try to account for relative terms here. We don't only consider the immigration rate of the high skilled workers, but also we put them into relationship with the immigration rate of low skilled workers. Like that, we take into account also the role that is played by low skilled immigration. We also try to evaluate this impact on the human capital accumulation depending on the level of development in the country of origin. So we try to account for heterogeneous terms that we might have, heterogeneous effects that we might have of these migration incentives here, depending on the level of income in the country of origin. And then we also, do some other specification where we can account for post-economy setup as well. So those are the results that we get. Let's focus on this last part of the table where we say we introduce the most of these components. So this is exactly the same specification as Bain. What I forgot to mention is that we build up on the specification and Bain also by introducing more waves of data inside. So we try to update their estimation. So what do we observe? So we are interested in this variable, the migration-driven incentive on the human capital formation, when we do observe that there is a consistently positive effect. This means what? It means that there is a positive effect from the fact that we have a high-skill migration on the human capital formation in the country of origin. And however, when we introduce, let's say when we try to account for a heterogeneous, when a heterogeneous effect that might occur depending on the level of development of the country of origin, we obtain that this first initial positive effect actually decreases with the level of economic development in the country. So meaning that the effect is the most beneficial to low income countries. So the low income countries are actually the group, the baseline group that we account here. Okay, now that we did this kind of estimates, we run a simulation analysis where we actually take some of those and we try. Yes.
You have 2 minutes. Sorry.
Okay. So what do we try? I took a lot of time. What do we try to do further is to evaluate this loss of human capital in a simulation analysis. So we have a contrafactual scenario where we look at the post-migration share of graduates, of high-skilled residents in the country of origin, but without any positive selection, so without any differential between high and low skill migration. And then the effective one, the effective share of graduate that we have post-migration by considering the positive selection. And so we try to see for which country in the world do we have a loss, and for which do we have a gain in terms of human capital accumulation. So I hope this graph is clear for you. Here we have on the y-axis we plot the loss, and here we have actually the level of development. So we have the GDP per capita on the x-axis. So what do we observe? So this first scenario is when we don't consider any impact of this variable of interest, which is the migration-driven incentive. So in this case, if we don't consider if we don't account in our model at all about the potential impact that immigration rate of high-skilled workers can have on human capital formation, then we do observe that we have a loss that is the highest for, let's say, the upper middle income countries. However, when we take into consideration,
your time is over.
Okay, it's just okay. Then I can just go directly to the summary, because yeah. So I just go to the summary to say that what we find is that there is a gain, but a small one, in terms of human capital accumulation and economic growth for low income and lower middle income countries. However, we have that this gain decreases for, let's say, richer countries. So further research maybe can complete this analysis and try to look more in detail in the high skilled immigration. For example, look at the university professors and so on, in a more detailed spatial level. Sorry, thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have a few minutes for questions. Only 4, I'm afraid, minutes. So questions? Now, well, in this, so I don't see any. Okay, so may I? In this last sentence, you say look at the categories of college graduates. Do you think that results can change with well, the definition of what is educated and not educated? For example, high school education in a country of Eastern Europe and in a country of another part of the world, less developed part of the world, can mean very different things. Also for the receiving countries, in the sense that receiving countries recognize some education degrees from foreign economies and others they don't. Do you think well, this is very difficult to take into account, but not impossible. Do you think that results could change a bit with this finer definition of what is high, medium, low education?
Yes, probably. So as you said, so our high skill is based on the education we take when you have a graduate diploma and upwards. But for sure, if we have a more nuanced, let's say more subtle definition about the different categories, we might obtain different results. In the sense that for some categories, maybe if we just consider, let's say, a subpart of some of the higher skill immigrants, we might have in the end a loss, even for those countries for which we observe. So what I didn't mention here because of time is that we do observe, so on average, we observe, let's say, a general gain for low-income countries, but for some, there is still a loss, such as some Caribbean countries and so on, where we have, and if you want, this condition depends on like what is really the size of high-skilled immigrants. If it's too high, for sure there will be a loss, especially they lose a lot of medical doctors, and yeah, and it's a key, of course, it's a key component for human capital accumulation and for development. So we can maybe more disentangle and build a more subtle definition of what is a high skill immigration instead of having something that is binary, let's say.
Yeah, it is known that in small countries, the brain drain is higher. But I was thinking also about the incentives in the sense that, well, if you know that your degree will be recognized in the country of destination, the incentive to invest in human capital to emigrate will be higher than in countries where you will have to repeat the exams or prove in some way that you really are an engineer, etc. So
that no, very, very fair comment. Yeah. I noted that down. So about the recognition of diplomas and so on. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Other questions, or maybe we don't have time? No. So let's go to the next.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. To the next presentation, which is time-space dynamics of return and circular migration by Amélie Constant.
Hello.
The floor is.
How do I do that? I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Now I can say share. Okay, I suppose you will see that.
Yeah.
Okay, hello, good morning or afternoon. That's a great session, and so many people I have cited in this chapter. Thank you, Klaus, for this amazing endeavor, the handbook, and for giving me this opportunity. And I already have new things to add, so we need to talk since this is a living chapter. So this is the presentation today is from the homonymous chapter I already mentioned. And for the sake of time, I will try to present just a few highlights from a few sections in the chapter, basically about the theories and empirics of return and repeat migration. It might be just a boring repeat for some of you, but this is what I decided to do today. In the chapter, there are many more sections that are interesting and different, such as I go over the joint decision making, the role of spouses and children for return migration, as well as I have a section about the returnees when they return and what they do when they return, and if they survive the return and stay or re-return to the back to the home. I start with self-selection, which is inherent to migration. We have self-selection with respect to characteristics, with respect to individual characteristics, with respect to household characteristics, but also we have selection in unobservables, which are tough to to pinpoint and measure empirically. And naturally, since there is selection, then when people move, this can lead to serious regional imbalances, whether they are demographic, socioeconomic, cultural, religious, etc. There are additional selections when people move, and these are outside, imposed by sovereign countries or by the business cycle or by other external conditions. For example, countries have laws about who is going to enter and who is going to leave. To enter, there may be health requirements, visa requirements, etc. To exit, it could be, loss of property, loss of visa status if you return, and so on and so forth. And these barriers amplify self-selection. Sometimes they may even reverse it. Of course, these barriers, the outside barriers, adversely affect the allocative efficiency of migration. Over the life course of immigrants in different countries, personal considerations, crisis, changes in circumstances, feedbacks, spillovers may equally prompt individuals to reconsider their initial migration decision at different periods in their life and effectuate return, circular, or onward migration. Why people leave, exit, either return or move onwards, or whatever they decide to do, or repeat migrate, all these decisions or who is effectuating each move is very important for policy making. First, from the point of view of the host countries, it's very valuable to know not only who are the people who exit, what are the characteristics, but also it's important to know where they're going. In this context, the distinction between returning home and going to a third country is paramount. For example, if immigrants move onwards in pursuit of a better life, this may suggest that the host country has failed. And this is different than when people return, because return is not an indication of a failure of the host country. In response to out-migration, host countries, if they know the characteristics of the exiters, so to speak, then they can devise policies to retain the people they want, especially when they have paid for their education, such as the education of natives, or they have paid for the integration of immigrants, and they want to maintain an advantage in the knowledge economy, that is to retain the highly skilled and the highly educated. For the home countries, it's equally important to know the characteristics of the returnees and prepare for their arrival. While return migration or also repeat or circular migration can mitigate brain drain, remittances will stop when people return. And home countries can try to implement monetary and non-monetary investments in order to counterbalance the loss of remittance inflows. Massive selective return migration may overwhelm the educational system and the housing markets in the home country. And of course, if large numbers of immigrants return to the homeland, this could affect bilateral relationships and agreements. It's very important to know the characteristics of the people who exit, who emigrate or return for migration research. Due to self-selection, those who exit may be a selected subsample of the initial arrivals. And this has serious ramifications in migration research. First, it may produce extreme bias in assimilation studies that compare immigrants to natives, whether these are about wage assimilation, job assimilation, health assimilation, etc. And second, it may produce extreme bias in studies about the impact of immigrants on the host country's economy, social and cultural realm, thus resulting in false narratives and wrong stereotypes occasionally. The theories about out-migration, there are many theories that explain the initial migration. Basically, they answer questions why migration occurs, where one goes, and even how many they will exit. But there are much fewer theories that explain the return migration and account for selection of return. Even fewer theories exist about the onward moves and repeat migration. And in addition to the theories, of course, the principles of self-selection can answer the questions of who will exit or what are the characteristics of the out-migrants. I will review only economic theories here, but I review many others in the chapter, such as network theories, structuralism, transnationalism, etc. So I'll start with our beloved neoclassical economics, which basically have nothing to do with return migration. By default, return migrants are losers because return migration results from mistakes in the initial decision. Therefore, we would expect that returnees are negatively selected in all economic outcomes, and maybe they are negatively selected in unobservables as well. Human capital theory goes along with neoclassical theory, is very good at predicting who is more likely to emigrate in the initial migration, but there are no predictions about the characteristics of the immigrants who will return or repeat or circulate. Maybe it's useful for onward migration if you perceive it as part of initial migration. And of course, the underlying assumption is that economic agents move to areas of high earnings where human capital is rewarded, subject to transferability. Therefore, there is no room for return migration that occurs without high earnings differentials. The Roy model of occupational choice introduced by Borjas in migration under certain assumptions in a partial equilibrium framework and accounting for skill differences and unequal distribution of skills between countries predicts the following. Initially, it says immigrants are positively selected if the home country offers relatively lower returns to skill, but they are negatively selected when the host country taxes the high skilled and subsidizes the low skilled. Interestingly, the theory allows for inverse sorting, which means the host country can appeal to persons who are relatively poor at home, but they can do very well once they are in the host country. So if initial selection really dictates the ensuing moves, if the initial selection was positive, that is, if the best and the brightest migrated first, then the returnees will be the worst from the best. And if the initial selection was negative, then returnees will be the best from the worst. And these predictions have been confirmed by several studies. This model also accommodates for multiple destinations. Selection in unobservables, such as ability and affability. Here, the unobserved abilities play a dominant role in immigration. We know that, but usually, as I said, it's hard to gauge, and unobservables are inferred from panel data. The new economics of labor migration predict that returnees are part of the optimal location plan over the life cycle. Returnees are positively selected with respect to earnings and negatively selected with respect to work effort. Status and prestige of the job are irrelevant in the return decision in this model. But what matters is the status of returnees when they return back home. And in this context, relative as well as absolute income considerations are paramount. Equally irrelevant in return migration is human capital. And lastly, the segmented labor market theory, which is demand-driven, is not does not allow for self-selection.
Amelie, you have 3 minutes.
Excuse me?
Amelie, you have 3 minutes.
3?
Yes.
Okay. Time goes fast when I talk. And so employers do the selection, and then so workers have no say in this. So returnees are not always winners. They might need to extend their sojourn abroad to make more money. Okay, empirics are very important to settle the selection in praxis. But we don't have good data even to this day. There have been advances, but we're still in sort of case studies. Although return migration has been found to be quite substantial, it varies between 20 and 75% among immigrants within their first 5 years after arrival. Onward migration varies between 20 and 66. And in fact, an interesting study by Cellar and al. Found that about 15% of the high-skilled immigrants in the US were onward or transit migrants. Recent developments, and I guess for the sake of time, I will stay only in this slide, but that's a good indication of the non-comparability of results of the empirical studies. So for example, when they looked at highly educated returnees in the US, there was negative self-selection found in earnings. And also that this selection affected cross-sectional studies. There was also negative selection found among highly skilled Indian immigrants in the US. And another study on the first generation of academics in the US found no self-selection in education. So basically that gives you an idea of each study being a case study. Even studies that use the same data for the same country might have different outcomes because they measure return migration differently, or because they look at the first generation or more generations, or because they look at, subsample populations like just the highly skilled or only the guest worker population. And in conclusion, I would say, there is no consensus about the self-selection of immigrants, and there's a lot more to be done to contribute to the theories and the self-selection when it goes to return and repeat migration.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Fascinating topic, this one. Questions? We have a few minutes for questions. Yes, Martin.
Hello, Amelie. I have a question. You mentioned that the migrants are target savers. So does it mean that they have a target, and until they save enough of the savings, they continue to remain in the host country, and then they return when they reach the amounts?
Yes.
Also, is it true? Was this theory validated empirically as well?
Well, target savers are usually under the guest worker schemes, the demand-driven schemes, and also in the new economics of labor migration, because people go with a goal to earn enough and then return. The goal was never to stay there forever. And so this is tricky because things change. There's inflation, there are many other things that happen, and often immigrants feel that they never catch up, they never can reach the targeted amount, and they might prolong their stay.
Okay, so that's why we see a lot of prolongation in migration spells. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Other questions? We have 1 minute. I was wondering about forced return migration now because of COVID to developing countries. Do you have, I think there are no data, of course, but what do you think, how are the ones who had to return because of COVID selected?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You mean?
Yes,
people
well, with COVID, many migrants return home, okay? Those who return to the developing countries.
But why do they return? You mean immigrants in the US go back to Africa?
Immigrants, yes, immigrants in developed countries, many of them return home because it was difficult without being able to work. They had to return home, didn't they? No, there are no data. You think that they stayed there waiting for the pandemic to subside, to finish?
Well, there's no doubt that everybody got hit, immigrants or not, got hit by the pandemic because there was this immense loss of jobs, and we're still probably stranded at home. But I'm not aware of mass exit. So my answer is I don't know, but I doubt that people returned home because of the pandemic.
Okay, other questions? No, okay, thank you very much. We can go on with the final presentation on social remittances by Michele Tuccio.
Oh, it's actually by me.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Jackie Wahaba.
Yeah.
I thought the first name was the one of the presenter. Okay.
That's okay.
Nice.
Right. Okay. So it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon, at least this afternoon for us in Europe. And thank you very much, Klaus, for inviting me to contribute to the handbook and also to this session. And I will try to be as short and as brief as possible. So the topic of this chapter is social remittances. And my aim today is to try to get you interested to go and read the chapter, which has been online for a while. So any comments would actually be really appreciated. So this is joint work with Michele Tuccio. And this is a very interesting topic. So what I would like to do is to just define what we mean by social remittances first, and then talk about measuring social remittances and the challenges when trying to do so. And then I'm going to try to provide evidence, and the evidence is going to be focused on 3 subtopics. So I will talk about social norms, political norms, and then economic norms and knowledge. And finally, I will try to conclude by highlighting the gaps in the literature. So the first issue is, what are social remittances? So this is really the biggest question, because as economists and as scholars in migration studies in general, everybody, at one stage or another looked at remittances, and we all know what financial remittances are. So those are, basically money sent by migrants back home. And huge amount of literature actually focused on financial remittances. However, social remittances are, as defined by Levitt in 1998, referred to basically non-financial transfers. And here we're talking about ideas, we're talking about behavior, we're talking about social capital, and we're talking about those flows of norms from, host countries to countries of origin. And what is important is to also keep in mind that we're talking about the diasporas who are sending back ideas and, new norms, but also return migrants. So the transfer here happens in different ways compared to financial remittances. So, diasporas might start to behave differently or to assimilate with the host country, and people in the origin country would observe those changes and might start to also behave in the same way, or it could also be basically returnees. Once they return back home, they start to demand political change. They might start to have different norms. And again, those will have spillover, externality impact, and will not only impact the migrants themselves, but their local community, their neighborhood, and at aggregate level, even the whole country. One important issue here is economists actually come to this topic of social remittances very late. So, from Levitt's work in 1998, and since then, sociologists, political scientists, other social scientists have actually been trying to look at this relationship between migration and social remittances. However, economists bring a very important issue to this whole study of social remittances. And this is basically the causal relationship. And this is what we as economists actually are good at. We are trying to disentangle whether, in which way, and to disentangle the reverse causality between migration and social remittances. So how do we measure social remittances? So basically, it's not going to be a surprise when I say it's really difficult to measure social remittances. Each study uses a different outcome, different data sets, and they try to capture, behavior or a change in behavior, whether it's economic behavior, whether it's social or political, to try and name this as a social remittance transfer or social norm transfer. Some studies use individual level data, household level data. Others have used field experiments. There are micro studies and macro studies. So the literature is, growing, continues to grow. But what is important here, as I mentioned, is that the whole literature is trying to advance and push what we already know about the impact of migration by trying to establish this causal relationship. First, by trying to control for indigeneity, because this is one of the big issues when it comes to, whether really is it migration which is leading to people change their norms, or it's mainly because people wanted to change their norms of they have migrated. And this is, this is one of the big sort of concerns in all of those studies on social remittances, whichever sort of data is used, or whichever country being studied. And obviously the second important issue as well, which we've heard about today, and is not going to come as a surprise, is the selectivity, because migrants are not random. So are we sure that it's because of migration that individuals change their norms, or, migrants are not random anyway, and they might have unobservable characteristics which might actually make them more likely to have different norms from, and here, remember that we're looking at transfer to the home country, to the sending country. So one of the important issues here is to try to, look at this literature and try to take stock of what we already know. And
Jackie?
Yeah.
There is a very short question. Do you want to answer now, or?
Can I keep it till the end, or is it a?
Well,
I can't see it.
It says conceptually using this part of what used to be called cultural imperialism. Maybe you can answer at the end.
Yes, I'll leave this till the end. Okay.
Okay.
So studies trying here to capture, the social remittances and transfer of norms and new ideas. But we have to keep in mind that it's rarely the case that actually we're able to be 100% sure that, those are transfer of norms from the host to the origin. And I'm going to come back to that because a lot of the literature here is basically providing just some suggestive evidence and some speculation about, the mechanism. So I will try to pick 2 or 3 studies under each sort of heading. So I will start by looking at social norms, and social norms, the sort of outcome studies are things like fertility, gender roles, gender equality, female political participation, religious preferences, and all of those studies are looking at a social angle and trying to actually see how returnees or current migrants and their families, their neighborhoods actually have different social norms to the rest of, the home country. So a very early on study, which actually is a macro study, was by Ben and co-authors. So they were trying to look at, migrants' fertility and how migrants' fertility tend to converge to the one of the destination. So when they looked at, how communities in the home countries have similar fertility patterns to, the host country, they sort of establish a sort of a link. And then the study by Bertoli and Marchetta, they were able to use micro level data, household level data, and they were able to actually control for indigeneity. And they found that when returnees went to high fertility destinations, mainly in the Gulf states, they tended to end up with having more children compared to, people who did not migrate. In a sort of a study which we did looking at Jordan, and it was an interesting study because again, we were looking at return migrants and we were looking at households of returnees. And because it is such a detailed sort of survey, we had information about, the role of women, the freedom of mobility of women, decision-making power of women, and all of those questions were asked to the women themselves, which is really a huge surprise. And we tried to control for who migrated and who returned. And we actually find that women in households where there was a returnee from a conservative Arab country, because all the returnees there were basically from Arab countries, but we differentiated between conservative or traditional and less traditional. We actually found that the gender norms of the more conservative countries, were adopted by the woman and the returnee household, which basically did sort of highlight that not always the norms are positive. Norms can also be negative and they can be transmitted. A huge number of studies actually looked at also political norms. And probably one of the most well-known papers, and the first paper to look at this sort of social remittances in the economics literature, is the one by Spillenberger, where he uses panel data to try to look at, those leaders who were foreign educated and where they got their education and whether they went to a democratic country or not. And again, they found, he found that basically when, individuals went to countries which are more democratic, they transmitted more democratic regimes. But the political norms literature, studies have looked at quality of institutions, accountability, democracy, voting, election, use so many different sort of types of data. So the paper by Docquier, for example, use aggregate panel data to look at democracy and immigration, find evidence of this transmission. And paper by Batista and co-author, they look at the case of an African country. And again, they find that when people go to more democratic countries, they want more political accountability. Again, in another study, I have looked at, using household level data for Morocco, we were able to actually have data where we have current migrants, returnees, and people who have not migrated, and to try to address something which has not been done before, not only who migrated and who returned, but where people go to, which is a destination selectivity, which hasn't been done before. We still found that returnees were more likely to, if they've gone to Western countries, to demand political change. If they have gone to neighboring countries and less democratic countries, they were less likely to do so. And finally, there is a huge literature as well, under the social remittances, looking at economic knowledge and economic norms, not only, political and social ones. So a number of studies look at diffusion of new innovations, new technologies. They look at, outcomes related to exports, patents, entrepreneurship. So, a very early study by Kerr, looked at this sort of migrant researchers in the US, again, focusing on the role of technology, the transmission of technology and know-how, between the host and countries of origin, find evidence of that. And a very recent paper by Danny Barr and Hilal Rapoport and co-authors, they exploit a natural experiment to try to look at basically migrants from the former Yugoslavia who were in Germany and then returned, and how when they returned, they actually, were able to, again, diffuse new knowledge and know-how, and they focused in particular on exports and trade in this paper and another paper as well. So to try to basically sum up what we know about this literature is there is a very clear evidence.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. There is a very clear evidence that, migration does lead to transfer of economic, political, and social norms. However, what is really important to note, and this is really important for policymakers, it really depends on the host country's norms, because some of those norms might not be better than the ones in the countries of origin. Like, for example, what we've seen in situations where fertility actually is higher, or when gender norms are more traditional. But the most important issue in this literature is that we don't know the mechanism. So there is still a huge gap. How does the transfer of norms happen while migrants live in the host countries? How are social remittances spread back in the home countries? Who matters the most in this knowledge transfer? In an ideal situation, we would like to see a person before they migrate and then after they return, and compare the norms they are exposed to while they are overseas to try to say, well, actually, we are quite sure of the mechanism and how it works. But obviously, we don't have that. So right now, we're still, we have only part of the story rather than the full story when we're looking at those transfer of norms and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a fascinating topic as well. So do you want to answer that question, or shall we start with the question?
Yeah, so let me see. So,
I didn't say
let me just say, I can say it.
Yeah, please do.
So I think the last point you made really fits this up. that we don't understand the mechanisms. And what we've been working on as economists with the empirical work is trying to sort out the mechanisms. And there is a lot of literature that goes back at least to the 1960s and 1950s that talked about these ideas. You know, the overall umbrella would be cultural imperialism, the film industry. There's an earlier, not earlier than that, but empirical literature on the increase in exports from the host country to home countries, just generally as products start going. So all of those tie in. So the idea is not new, but what we can contribute as economists, well, with our causal analysis type things is new. So I think that's what I was
well, exactly. And I think this is the point I made by saying that economists came to this, you know, pretty late, and their contribution is basically this causal relationship. I don't know, you know, whether I think I would prefer to call it social remittances, because it's basically, we're also looking at some, you know, in some studies, just, you know, if you have migrants moving from Cape Verde to, you know, their neighbor African country, there is no imperialism in that case, right? So we're not only talking about south to north necessarily. So I would keep an open mind and I would call it social remittances for now, but people might disagree.
Okay, we have 2 minutes. Okay, Klaus, please.
First, taking up Ira's issue with the exports and the changing norms migrants bring with them to the host country. This would mean then we have something like social migration or whatever. I mean, migration of norms, perhaps. That's an additional way of looking at streams. One remark. The other remark is, I mean, the issue has a lot to do with the size and identity of diasporas. Now, if a migrant comes, for simplicity, comes to a host country and returns, yes, just for simplicity, the quality, I mean, the structure and the identity of the diaspora is very important. If he's just living around like the others, yes, then it might be not different from home, and so there might be no feedback when the person comes home. But if the person lives alone in a global setting, it brings back different things. So, I mean, this is very complex, and we are just at the beginning as economists, I understand. So is this kind of complex relationship already investigated, and to what extent?
Yeah, so I think related to the first point you've made, I guess when we're looking at a migrant or the diaspora, we think of it as an assimilation, right? Whether it's culture assimilation or economic assimilation. So this is how we look at it. Concerning the second point, I totally agree. And I think this is one of the things which we lack data on, because what we would really like to know is the migrant, how does a migrant compare to the rest of the native population in the host, and what sort of norms and how those compare to when we send, you know, those norms back home. And unfortunately, we don't have the data to allow us to do those two-way sorts of studies. But this really would be, I hope, the next step for this literature, to be able to see this mechanism. Yes.
We are out of time, but Matlub, if you want very quickly to say your question, and then we have to.
Nice to see you.
Yes,
yeah, good
we
to
have
see you. I just kind of, slightly related, I suppose. I've just kind of this underlying question about what is good or bad norm, so to speak. You see what I mean? So I mean, I know you're talking about bad norm, maybe fertility is increased or whatever, but in terms of judging this thing, there's a kind of a definitional thing that this is a good norm or bad norm. And if I go back to kind of, Arab Spring kind of situation, is political change necessarily going to be a good thing? And, how quickly that might happen. So it's just kind of, thinking about how do we think about norms?
So I think when I was talking about the bad norms, I had in my mind higher fertility, but more important, it was the questions regarding women. And in the paper, actually, we have a very detailed sort of outcome. So women were not allowed, for example, to leave the house without getting permission. You know, they don't have freedom to work, to visit family. You know, they think that they are second-class citizens to men. So I don't think that, especially for that particular paper, anybody would disagree that those are bad norms. But in general, I know it's a very tricky sort of labeling to use. So yes,
Okay, it's a pity, but you can write, of course, to the authors to continue talking about these fascinating topics. And so thank you to everybody. I've been very happy to participate in this session and to be allowed to be chair. And thank you, Klaus, also for everything and all of you. And well, this is the end, I suppose, of this exciting conference.
Yeah, thank you, Marina, because we are here at the end of the conference, and I was part of the organizers. I certainly will, and we have no plenary. Certainly have to be grateful also to EBES and EBES staff to provide us with the framework for doing this. This is part of GLO's mission to collaborate with organizations and to gain from each other. So we will go on having similar kind of events, not only with EBES, but outside. You have seen that. The idea is not only to provide GLO with a research background, so working in various areas of human resources with researchers on the state of the art. Is also about, let's say, reflecting where we are and where we could go, and maybe also find friends and partners for new research parts. So that's certainly one idea. So the project is huge, but and it's not at the end, but it's having strong push. And I should also tell to everybody who is now listening, we still have open chapters, but many sections are closing. And the idea is certainly to get groups of papers, yes, like migration now into all of them into a publication level. The whole physical publication, I mean, as a book, will still take a little bit more time. That's because we have 600 chapters and lots of interactions to fill, but this is not a problem as long as we make the whole project take it as an advantage, because we would like to have it living, and you never with this kind of project you're never at the end, and this means however with this project it has not to be an end, because the promise of Springer Nature is that we can update chapters, we can have many versions of physical books in the future if we want, we can get new authors in, and so on, all this. So this is all living, while the old versions always stay available online. So please advertise for it, use it in the practice of your research work. And all those who have been here and in the previous days and will hear very soon in a systematic way again from us. As you know, some papers are already published, others are not even completed fully, and some are in between. So that's how it is with these kind of projects. That's fine. That goes on. But as I see, I mean, we have entire sections. We are moving also with different speed, with different sections. Some sections are completely done. Let's say it's the technology and labor section, for instance, and others are very close to, like behavioral economics and so on. Okay, so with this said, I am looking forward to being in contact with all of you very soon, and thank you very much for being with us and at this interesting conference, and I'm sure we will meet very soon again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.